And so we just like came up with an idea like, oh, we have this infrastructure where we run hubs and indexers. Maybe other people want it. Like nobody else seems to be doing it right now. And Varun coincidentally had cast it out maybe like a day, 2 days ago. Like this seems like a good time for alchemy for Farcaster. Somebody should do it. It's funny because turns out it was good time, but we didn't think it was good time. We were like, oh, Varun's being Varun. He's just saying things. Who wants alchemy for Farcaster today? But because he had casted it out and we kind of already had the stuff working in-house, we put up a single landing page that said hosted hubs. We didn't even know if it was going to be part of the company. So we called it Hubs Cross Neynar because Neynar was the app and then it was Hubs. And it had a simple Stripe checkout link and that was it. Like no trial, no free tier, whatever, just like pay and we'll give you the hubs. We didn't even know how to give you the hubs because we hadn't really built it. And we were like, the only person who's going to subscribe is Varun because he'd probably want to check it out. He was actually the first subscriber.
Like, let's see how serious you are about your cast here.
He actually, I just told him 2 days ago we should refund his subscription. He's still an active subscriber. Like he's a first subscriber and he still pays for hosted hubs, which we should stop making him pay at this point.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, this is Sina with another episode of Into the Bytecode. My guest today is Rish, co-founder of Neynar. In this conversation, we talked about Rish's path through the idea maze from leaving Coinbase to working on Neynar, and how he and his co-founder Manan got the conviction to bet on Farcaster like they did, and how he thinks about founders and startups' ability to take these kinds of bets as one of their core differentiators versus bigger companies in general. We talked about how Neynar is architected under the hood, which I think is an interesting peek into how an early infrastructure company that could grow to be at the scale of Alchemy or even AWS works relatively early in its journey. We talked about how Rish thinks about companies becoming extensions of their founders and how he's seen this to be the case with Coinbase, Farcaster, and Neynar. We also talked about his co-founder relationship with Manan and what they've learned in working together. Overall, I've really enjoyed getting to know Rish. I think he's a deep and principled thinker and really cares about what he's building. And I can't wait to see them go on to more success from here. I also want to say this podcast is for informational purposes only. It's not financial advice or recommendation to buy or sell securities. And with that, I'll leave you to it, and I hope you enjoy. Into the Bytecode is sponsored by Optimism. The Optimism Collective is building the open source modular software project known as the OP Stack, which allows developers to run layer 2 blockchains, while also addressing key governance and economic challenges in the wider ecosystem. Optimism is also leading decentralized grants experiments, like retroactive public goods funding, which recently granted 10 million OP to projects across developer tooling, infrastructure, and education. More recently, they had a major milestone by adding Coinbase's blockchain Base to also be governed by Optimism governance, and also contribute a portion of their sequencer revenues back to the collective. I've known the Optimism team for many years and know that they're dedicated to both scaling Ethereum and extending its ability to build better economic structures. So, if you're interested in learning more, whether you want to build something new or you want to apply for grant funding, then I encourage you to check out Optimism at optimism.io. I thought maybe one place to start would be you used to work at Coinbase.
Correct.
And I'm curious what your kind of journey and idea maze was from the time you left Coinbase to today, or to working on Neynar.
So I joined so I had been interested in crypto for a bit before joining Coinbase. Like I was at Facebook earlier than that, and when joining Facebook, I had looked at Coinbase open positions, and for some reason, I don't know why, hadn't applied, and just went and moved to Facebook instead. Should have applied, obviously, but didn't. And then it was there in the back of my mind. I was playing around with some stuff. Ethereum had come out recently, and I knew about crypto since like initial Bitcoin run during the 2013 period. I was in college and it went from $100
That's
to
the Mt. Gox
$1,000.
one.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the first time I had actually interacted with it. Funnily enough, a few students in college got into trouble because they were using college servers for mining. That was another way I got exposed to like, oh, what is happening, what is mining, et cetera, et cetera. But then kind of forgot about it. And then Ethereum came about, and that was the first time I was like, oh, wait, there's actually something happening. And Ethereum also seemed a little bit more interesting, where you could now have like decentralized compute. And for some reason, I found that easier to understand than like the decentralized money piece. And so I got more into it. And then when at Facebook, Coinbase happened to reach out, and I was already thinking about this, hadn't applied to Coinbase. And then when they reached out, I was like, oh, yeah, we should talk. And so talked to them, moved to Coinbase. I was on the growth team on the retail side, like the consumer side, when I joined, and ended up working with Manan, who's my co-founder now, on this product called Coinbase Earn, which was right after the Earn.com acquisition from Balaji. And it had like 10,000 something users, didn't make revenue. And that was the first product we got to work on, and ended up making a pretty big product out of it. Like it became a meaningful revenue generating business for Coinbase, probably one of the first non-trading revenue pieces for the company. Had millions of users using it. Obviously, there were some bull market vibes around it, where a lot of people came in to learn about the whole token craze that was happening at the time. And that's also how Manan and I got to know each other and work together. We had always been interested in this space of like the intersection of social and Web3. I had always been interested in social and Web3 like separately. That's why I was first at Facebook and then moved to Coinbase. And then at some point I started intersecting the two. And one of our job descriptions at Coinbase was to figure out how do these things mix together, and what role can Coinbase play in this space. Like Brian Armstrong has always had this idea of doing something more in the consumer space that is not strictly trading. And so Maya and I would like talk to these Web3 protocol teams, like we talked to PPIF back in the day that was running fully on mainnet, back when you could do things on mainnet. And then BitClout, Diamond Hands, and that became DCell. Lens from Aave came out, and then Dan and Varun started talking about Farcaster, which wasn't decentralized back in the day, but they had the idea of how to decentralize through hubs. And I remember that like the Farcaster plan was the first time we actually felt like, oh, this could actually be meaningful, because every other plan we had seen wasn't scalable enough. Like we always felt it was too on-chain, and even Lens, which was on Polygon, like we were already thinking like, hey, this is not going to scale because it's fully on Polygon. And Farcaster was the first time where we were like, oh, this is kind of built with scaling in mind. And so we got interested into it. And we tried doing a few different things with Farcaster inside Coinbase back in the day, but it was too early, and those kind of things don't always happen in big companies. And we were nearing our 4-year mark, so we started thinking about what we should do. We actually started with building a social consumer app, which was an NFT app built on top of Farcaster Rails. So it would take the identity and network graph from Farcaster, and we were already doing kinds of compute to like show you the NFTs your network had liked or had consumed in some way. And we were using Warpcast APIs, or back then it was still Farcaster APIs because the app was called Farcaster, not Warpcast. And it was slow because, calling somebody else's APIs, you have to do a bunch of compute, and it wasn't the best experience. And then they launched hubs, which was a year and a quarter ago. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it's only been like 15 months. And so we started running our own hub. We were probably among the first people outside of Merkle to run our own hubs and indexers. And so we built our app off of our own infrastructure.
So you did that initially for performance reasons, or to kind of like just get more closely exposed to the surface area of what's going on?
Both. We hadn't then decided that we were going to be a Farcaster company to say.
Yeah.
So the initial impetus was just like performance. And then obviously we had been interested in the infrastructure for like years at this time. Like Manan and I joined Farcaster in 2021. Like there were like maybe 10, 15 DAUs, not even, less than 200 people on the protocol. There was a Mac app and you could just like push casts out and that was it. So we had been on Farcaster for like years at this time, and we had obviously been super interested. And so there was part of like, okay, let's just understand what hubs are. And part of it was like, okay, this will actually meaningfully improve our app. Like when Dan used to try our app, it would take like 30 seconds for his feed to load because he had like such a big graph on Farcaster already that the Warpcast APIs were too slow. And he had always been like, hey, your app is too slow. I can't use your app. And he was one of our early dog fooders. So we were like, okay, yeah, we also need to improve app performance. So we moved on to hubs. Obviously, our app became much better. But you know how consumer things go. Like it's hard to do consumer with a very specific like social niche. And so one of these evenings, like very similar to today right now, Manan and I were just sitting brainstorming like, hey, what do we do next? It's kind of like stagnated around like 40, 50 DAU. We never publicly launched that app, but we could already see like there wasn't like that viral hockey stick growth you would want to see in a consumer product. And so we just like came up with an idea like, oh, we have this infrastructure where we run hubs and indexers. Maybe other people want it, like nobody else seems to be doing it right now. And Varun coincidentally had cast it out maybe like a day, 2 days ago, like, this seems like a good time for alchemy for Farcaster. Somebody should do it. It's funny because turns out it was good time, but we didn't think it was good time. We were like, oh, Varun's being Varun. He's just saying things. Who wants alchemy for Farcaster today? But you know, because he had casted it out and we kind of already had the stuff working in-house, we put up a single landing page that said hosted hubs. We didn't even know if it was going to be part of the company. So we called it Hubs Cross Neynar because Neynar was the app and then it was Hubs. And it had a simple Stripe checkout link and that was it. Like no trial, no free tier, whatever, just like pay and we'll give you the hubs. We didn't even know how to give you the hubs because we hadn't really built it. And we were like, the only person who's going to subscribe is Varun. Because he'd probably want to check it out. He was actually the first subscriber.
Like, let's see how serious you are about your cast here.
He actually, I just told him 2 days ago we should refund his subscription. He's still an active subscriber. Like he's a first subscriber and he still pays for hosted hubs, which we should stop making him pay at this point.
That's funny.
Yeah. But so Varun subscribed within the hour and then 2 more people subscribed like the same hour. And like we had just launched, we didn't know what to do. Like 2 random people have paid us and we don't know how to give them the product because we haven't built the product. So we were like emailing everybody like, hey, hold on, we're going to give you the product shortly, it's coming. And then we kind of stayed up that night, externalized our internal infra, like created gateways through our domain. And then we emailed them back with access points and like a snippet of code of how to get started. And that was kind of, to your point, the idea is like once we started doing that and we started talking about it, and then as soon as they got access to hubs, they wanted like better APIs because the hub data is not meant for application level, it's meant for transport level. We had some APIs, so we started externalizing that, and it just kept going from there. And now we have like thousands of people using it, multiple companies.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Maybe before jumping more into Neynar, you were talking about how at Coinbase you started already thinking about social, or you were thinking about social with Messenger and then Web3.
Yeah.
What in your mind are the most interesting ways that the two of those combine? And what parts of it are we seeing already today? Like I think there's, what do we have today? We have this on-chain social graph slowly emerging, right? And we're seeing the composability of that with NFTs and hypersubs and, token gating channels and all sorts of things that are starting to emerge. But how, as someone who's thought about this for a while, like when you zoom out, how do you think about the affordances that are there with this combination?
Yeah. And, I think we're still at the beginning. So you probably thought about some which you should add. But to just tell you how we have been thinking about it. So we think about it in like 2 or 3 key ways. One is obviously, I think this is true of all blockchain or Web3, is the concept of exit, right? Like if you are the owner and there's no gating permissions, and you can exit to do something of your choice. Like if you're a developer, you can exit off of Neynar, run your own hub. If you're a user, you can exit off of Warpcast, run your own client. You own your space in the end. Most people don't care about it unless you get deplatformed from Twitter or Reddit or whatever. For what it's worth, like my Twitter account got deleted for some like completely random reason.
I saw that. Why did that happen?
I have no idea. Like I've appealed like 5 times and I just get the generic customer support email saying, hey, your appeal's been rejected, you can't get it back, whatever. But mine wasn't even super active on Twitter. I was just like recasting some like tech article or some founder, and I would cast out every once in a while. I say cast now, but tweet out every once in a while. But until you get deplatformed, most users don't really care about exit. But exit, I think, is like the fundamental underlying layer. I think it's important. The second thing that I get personally excited about is the notion or the idea that everything is a building block that you can do something else with. And this doesn't exist in Web 2 social. Like even if you account for APIs, where let's say, APIs were available, they weren't extravagantly priced, none of which are true today, but let's say they were. Even in that case, you can only build off of what's available on the APIs. You can't actually build off of things you might want to build, but the APIs are not available. And that, I think, is a key unlock, where in Web3, like things like Hypersub exist because the protocol just has the identity and the graph data, and now you can do what you want with it. Warpcast didn't need to make monetization APIs available of some kind, which they were never going to do anyway. That's not their priority. And so like this like permissionless building blocks is something I'm super excited about, probably because we are engineers and builders at heart and we kind of get excited about that. But I think it's also super important for customers because they get net new products out of this and it's better for everybody in the ecosystem. And thirdly, I think because of 2, we get new monetization models. That can benefit everybody in the ecosystem. Like it can involve the protocol, it can involve different teams, different customer segments, or in some cases be very confined. Like the tipping thing goes from like the token allocation of some bucket to the receiver, and the sender isn't involved, and you just like tip some small amount. But even simple tipping things didn't exist unless you had like a specific monetization model in that Web 2 schema. So I think monetization will also improve and everybody will actually economically benefit.
That's huge. It feels like we've barely started to scratch the surface on that last one.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Even thinking about something like Bountycaster, I kind of think back to the Friday where Frames launched and all these different teams started like funding Frames bounties.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like a decentralized like Gitcoin grants or hackathon or something like that just came together without any high level organization.
Yeah.
And it's so cool that kind of a thing can just emerge.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, super early. I'm super excited about it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So what is Neynar?
So Neynar today
we should get into this and then we can expand from here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Neynar today is mostly a Farcaster infrastructure company. We provide Farcaster infrastructure all the way from like hosted hubs, which in Farcaster land or in Web3 land is just nodes, but in Farcaster lands, they're called hubs, to like application level APIs, hosted databases, data products where we pipe or stream data into somebody else's database, webhooks as a service. We have SQL playgrounds where you can come query data. So it's like a wide spectrum of products meant for developers. And you can pick and choose between these building blocks to see what you can build. Obviously, we take feature requests all the time. So if somebody's listening to this and wants something we don't offer, please reach out. And then we recently launched a small consumer product, which is called the Frame Studio, where you can come in and build frames without code. We are going to keep iterating on that product. Compared to the infra side, it's a much smaller piece of the Neynar ecosystem. But we have some exciting updates coming up over the next weeks and months. So I think hopefully it'll also become a meaningful part of our business.
Okay, we'll get into that. So one thing I was curious to dig into a little bit was just like what Neynar looks like under the hood. Because it's also, like when you look at a company like AWS or Alchemy from the outside, you're like,
Yeah.
I imagine this thing must be insane under the hood. It's like the level of complexity they're dealing with. And I feel like this is a unique opportunity for me to hear from someone who's been, who's relatively early in this journey of building this infrastructure.
Yeah.
But like how's the system evolved from that beginning
Yeah.
days? What does it look like today? What do you think it will look like in, further into the future?
Yeah. Also, we are like very early on in this journey. I think this is going to get more and more interesting. So when we started, we were running a single hub, and we were piping data into our own database off of that hub, using open source code called the replicator that still exists. It's called the replicator. It's part of the Hubble repo. And then we were building our own APIs off of that database. All the way to today, we run like multiple hubs. Like there's a mini network of hubs inside Neynar where you can like ping pong between which service you're using on our side, and it goes to one hub. And if one hub fails, it'll automatically start using the other hub and so on.
So this is like load balancing and redundancy type stuff?
Yeah, load balancing and redundancy. We also do things like, I guess it does fall under load balancing and redundancy. Like in some cases, one hub gets overloaded with the amount of requests, and it'll go over memory limits or CPU utilization or something, and then it'll like pipe over to some other hub. One thing I find really cool is that we recently did this thing internally where you can start a hub by just changing one single digit, where you have like, we have a line of code that says how many hubs are running, and you just go and change it from like 7 to 8, and it just, now you have an 8th hub. And so that kind of simplicity took some time to get to. So we have that. And then we have like a range of other things where we have obviously replicators running against those hubs. And these replicators are now custom in the sense that we took the open source one, and then because we have different uses for the data, we write data slightly differently, and it connects to the rest of our services slightly differently. So it's a custom version of that open source replicator. And then we have databases, Redis clusters for memory optimization so that not everything hits the database, separating compute, storage, memory, all of that stuff. It's still very early, going to have to keep doing all of this. Manan, I think, recently casted out something where hub data used to be like 40 gigabytes. It's like 140 gigabytes now. It's on the way to be like a terabyte by the end, like the end of this year or something. So I think the data is meaningfully growing, and people using the data are meaningfully growing. So I think it's a moving piece, and we'll have to keep thinking about how to actually scale the throughput as the ecosystem grows.
Yeah. Have you had do you have any fun stories of like having to get up at 3 a.m. because everything broke down, or? Yeah, too many of those. I think yesterday it was 8 a.m. or something like here, but 3 a.m. Eastern time. So would have been 3 a.m. if I wasn't already in London. But yeah, there was this like 2-week period around the frames time where the infra we had built, like, we were getting a steady growth of subscribers. That was crazy, right? That was like a multiple, like...
Yeah, that was like a solid 100x increase.
Yeah,
at least
in the span of like 4 days or something.
Yeah.
So how did you deal with that as an infra company that's basically servicing almost all of it, I imagine?
Yeah, I think what happened was at that time, the demand was so large that there were a few people still using Warpcast APIs. And that week, because Warpcast was going down all the time because of all this new demand, they shut down those APIs and said, hey, go use Neynar. And so everybody who was not on Warpcast was on Neynar. And when Warpcast would go down, all that usage would move to alternative clients like Supercast. And so Supercast would be hosting like almost all of Warpcast's usage. And all of that was coming down to our services. And so that was actually a pretty intense time. It was very fun, but also pretty intense, where we weren't sleeping. Like, we were sleeping 3 hours a day. We'd sometimes have to sleep in rotations where I'd be like, oh, I'm going to go take a nap.
Wow.
And you do this, or you take a nap, I do this. We were cranky with each other. I was stressed out all the time, and I'd make Manan stressed out. He doesn't get stressed out at all. So I'd be mad at him as to why he wasn't stressed out. I'd be like, you should be stressed out more. And he was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a rougher than usual time, but it was also fun. It allowed us to like quickly scale up our infrastructure to a point where now we can handle that load on a daily basis, and it works. And it put infrastructure, like we were very much into like feature building mode, which we still are, but it allowed us to like recognize that as an infra company, like that part of the stack is meaningfully important, and we need to make sure our infra scales with the rest of our feature stack. And so we made our first full-time hire right around then. So Brian, who's our first founding engineer, full-time DevOps infrastructure role. He's very good at what he does. And so that allowed us to like actually get to the point, like I was saying, like you change a digit and we have a new hub. Like that's all Brian behind the scenes.
Man, this is like a DevOps person's dream, right?
Yeah.
Like new infrastructure, playbooks don't exist, like crazy demand that's growing.
Yeah.
Seems really fun.
Yeah. It is, and I mean, I am a pretend engineer, so I'm trying to do what I can. But yeah, on the engineering side, like Manan and Brian, I think it's very fun.
Yeah. Do you see as time goes on, how does this usually evolve for an infra company? Because I feel like you'll probably have to spend a good amount of effort just like keeping up with the network scaling outside of adding any features or anything like that.
Yeah. And that is, I think, a key component, because I think what we are already finding is that if you are a solo developer, the costs are already too high for you to run the whole thing just for a side project. Like you can get like our cheapest tier today is $9. And that's insanely low compared to like the amount of time and money you would have to spend to run your own hub and replicator and a cloud hosted database and keep it fully in sync the whole time. And so our job here is to like keep providing this to like at the cheapest level possible, so that anybody who's serious, like we don't do free because we think we are catering to the people who are actually serious about doing something.
Yeah.
So you have to put down a small amount of money. But if you're serious enough to put down a small amount of money, then we want to be here and abstract everything else away and keep doing that for years from now. And so like from a high level, like we'll have to scale all the different parts of the ecosystem. So there's obviously the nodes itself, but just like the processing. So like there's compute, there's hard storage, like databases, there's memory, RAM, Redis, cache, whatever you call it. All of these need to scale separately. In some ways is auto scale as the demand comes in, but also in a way that's optimized for our business expenses, so we don't like overspend on these things.
How does that, like, how do these resources kind of like match up against costs? Because in some ways, like the costs seem more variable under the hood, whereas the revenue you're having is this like fixed price per month per like account.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this still has to be found out, where we have been good about thinking about our infrastructure in the right ways, where we can control our costs, that it's not like, hugely expensive for the company to do it for the number of customers we have today. Like it is actually a good business. I honestly don't know how exactly it'll change as things evolve. I think we'll go through ups and downs where at some points it'll be like pretty profitable and some points not so profitable, some points just break even before it stabilizes somewhere. But I think we have the right talent and we are hiring the right people who understand this level of thing, are excited about this, where we can actually do it in a way that is a good business.
To what extent do you feel like you're you're thinking through things from first principles or having to do that versus like seeing good examples out there where you're like, if we just do this, it will work out? Like, is there a way that, say, AWS has been architected or scaled, or like, are there examples like that you look like out there as the kind of like path to move through?
Yeah, good question. So I think it depends on which layer of the problem we are speaking to. So scaling hardware like if you know what to scale and you're familiar with AWS, which has the super clunkiest interface, but if you are familiar with it, you kind
It's
of,
crazy.
yeah, you kind of know how to go about it, and then you can do that thing. But I think the harder thing here is to know which knob to turn when. And there are, like, for example, we have incoming queries or API requests that might use less memory than what a machine has, but I might use more storage because we have to index the data differently. Like you have to index it with different keys. So now you have way more storage, but because the indexing is good, you need less RAM. Could be vice versa.
Because otherwise you would have to load them into RAM and kind of do some sorting or like
Exactly.
picking in memory.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And you can also do it the other way around, where you have some giant blobs of data and you keep a state of that with a new key in memory all the time. And whenever a request comes in, you just serve it off of memory. It never hits the database. And it depends on what kind of request you're getting, and you have to kind of think about which request should hit the database more often than not. And if it does need to hit the database, then you have to like index it in some ways. If it doesn't need to hit the database, then you can keep it in memory and then serve it straight out of memory. And then you have to like make sure you expose these kind of requests in the right manner so that you can somewhat predict what's coming in and serve it from the right stack. And that requires...
Wait, what do you mean by that? Like, what's an example of that?
So, for example, let's say you wanted to fetch the reactions on a cast.
Yes.
And let's say you were like you know how if you followed the frame meta, there was this meta where you had to like and recast a cast to get access to the frame, right? And so let's say you're building a frame like that. For that, you need real-time access. Like, has this user reacted to this cast? And you need to be getting the protocol data at that point in time. And so you can't have a saved state of that in memory because it needs to be fresh.
You need to like pull it from the ground truth, right?
Exactly. Then. Yeah. But now imagine like you wanted to fetch the text of that same cast that needed to be recasted. That doesn't need to be fetched real time, right? Because the text is the text. It's not going to change. You can delete the cast and make a new cast, which will have a new hash. But for that cast, the text is the same. So now you can think about how to separate the different pieces of what everybody thinks is the same component and fetch it from two different parts of the stack. And that's at the super small cast level. And now you can do that across like all the different interactions you can have and all the different APIs you can have. And it's a pretty meaningful piece of work when you do it at scale. And you have to think through every part of this.
So is the workflow here that you literally sit down and you're like, we're opening up this new API. You need to kind of think through the user interaction that's happening and exactly what the sequence looks like there. And then also have an understanding of the stack on your end and kind of like map these to each other as you're implementing an API. Like this is the process that you go through. Yeah, we think about like every single component. Like even for that reactions, we'd think about when you think about the reactor, like, you know, if you're interacting with the frame, have you reacted? Who's you? And we'd think about your FID, your like display name, your PFP, and every single bit of this would be at some part of the stack. And it would be optimized to fetch from that part of the stack. So the only real-time fetching we are doing is the only component we need to real-time fetch, and everything else is stored in some optimal manner. And that's what makes the API snappy and keeps our costs low and allows us to expand quicker. But it also does mean that you have to put in all this work up front, and every time you make something, you have to think about it the right way. So on your end, are these like... How is this all architected on your end? Do you have do you have some flexibility in like, I want to pull this from disk, or I want to do X, Y, or Z, or are they kind of defined as, how are these resources defined on your side? I'm just kind of curious, and it's fun to peek under the hood. Yeah, absolutely. So we have gotten better at abstractions and interfaces
over the months.
Yeah.
When we started, obviously, there was like one single interface and everything would go through that same pipe. But now we have different layers of interfaces. Like essentially, you can think of them as different function calls, and all those functions can take some inputs and think about which part of the stack to fetch it from, what to fetch, what to pipe to other functions. And like there's a layer of interfaces and they go from one to the other to the other. So for anything you want to fetch at the highest level, you can specify what you want to fetch, how much of that should hydrate. So like you can get a reactor with just the FID, or you can get the reactor with the full profile. You can get a cast with just the hash or with the full
And that
content.
basically nests like other calls within it if you want to hydrate it.
Yeah, it nests all of that. You can specify up front where it should fetch it from, which part of the stack, like does it need to be real time or not? If it doesn't need to be real time, how stale can it be? If you can also specify things like fetch it and then update it immediately. So like async update the background storage.
Wow.
So we have built layers of interfaces and we continue building layers of interfaces. Some of that is like, some of those interfaces actually shouldn't exist now because we should throw out that old code. But that's another tech debt journey to solve. But yeah, ideally, we like to keep all of these things in a way where we can just specify what to do and then you put it into the function and it comes back out.
Into the Bytecode is sponsored by Privy. One of the biggest problems we're grappling with as builders working on crypto-enabled applications is how to make the right trade-offs between user experience on the one hand and security and privacy on the other hand. How do we promote self-custody and ownership while letting the application shine rather than the crypto behind it? So Privy plays an important role here. They provide simple onboarding so anyone can connect to your app easily by allowing them to sign in with an existing wallet or by making it easy for you to provision a new self-custodial wallet for them, linking to social logins like Google, Twitter, or Discord. I personally have faith in Privy because of the team. Henry Stern, who's one of the co-founders, was previously on an episode of this podcast, so you can listen to that conversation for more of a deep dive. And he and his partner, Asta Lee, have been thinking about data privacy and security for a long, long time. And you can see this in the level of thought they're putting into the product. So if you're working on a new product and thinking about how to reach a wider group of users without compromising on either user experience or privacy and security, then I encourage you to check out Privy at privy.io. It's also wild that to be so closely mapped to the growth of Farcaster as a network. That's kind of a scary thought of like, as this network grows, you just need to service more and more.
Yeah.
And all of it. I mean, it's really cool that it would be cool to visualize this in some way and see how all of this is expanding and growing over time.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest graph is our subscriber and churn data mapped against Farcaster DAUs, and they're not that different. Like there's some differences.
Interesting.
But they're not that different. And obviously, to your point, we are mapped to Farcaster growth in some ways. That's not a decision we made either randomly or easily. I think we spent time thinking about it, and we very consciously decided that yes, we want to do this, and we are excited about it, and it makes sense. And one of the beliefs I have as an entrepreneur is, small companies, they have a few edges they have against big companies: pace, understanding of the market, customer support. In some cases, like you're just closer to the customer as the founder. And then one of the things I think we have is startups can take risks that they think are good risks, but literally everybody else in the world thinks it's a bad risk to take. And in 99.9% of the time, the rest of the world is right. And it is a bad risk to take, and the companies fail. And we might still fail. But in 0.1%, it is a good risk to take. And that's the only way a startup can actually work, where you are ready to take a risk that somebody else isn't. Because if the market is ready to take that risk, then it's already been taken and that opportunity is gone. You have to take a risk that nobody's taken, but you somehow think is the right risk to take. And I remember thinking about this, and I was like, what is a risk I think is a good risk to take? And like 9 months ago, 10 months ago now, it felt like Farcaster was a good risk to take. And nobody in the, like, there are a few companies today who are like doing Farcaster, but back when we were doing Farcaster, there was nobody outside of Merkle doing it. And I remember thinking like, that feels like a good risk to take. And that's what we did. And that's the only protocol we serve.
So the logic, like the principle is that if, you know, let's say big companies or more established players are looking at Farcaster, why wouldn't that principle apply to everyone? Like you always want to be, say, contrarian and correct, right? Like take risks that others aren't taking, but that you think are right. Why do you think a startup, like that's particularly so for a startup and is like a core part of how one has to operate?
Because great question, by the way, because the ROI you want, like the R, is so small. Like when I'm making that investment, like I'm looking for the first glimmer of like, I was looking for that first Stripe checkout link, right? Like, is somebody other than Varun going to pay? That was my signal. If you are if you're somebody who's already making money in some context, it doesn't matter. Like you're not looking for the first Stripe checkout link. You're looking for some volume. And there was no volume. Like we are a 9-month-old business today, and the first 6 months were essentially no volume, even compared to our own metrics. And so it was obviously no volume for anybody else who was already doing some business. And so when you think about it from an established provider and you're thinking about, hey, is this risk worth taking? The worth part is really not worth, because you're like, hey, I'm going to take this risk, but I don't know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen.
So it's an expected value, which is probability times like size.
Yeah.
And the probability is the same for everyone. Like even if you're like a strategic mind in a big company, you're evaluating it correctly. You're like, Farcaster has a 10% chance of success, which is actually much higher than everyone else thinks.
Yeah.
But the amplitude is still so small that you wouldn't go after it at that point in time.
Yeah. And I mean, yes. But I think if you talk to the founder of these companies, they might, because that's the type founders are. Like, I think if you talk to Brian Armstrong, he might have actually said yes. But because the rest of the folks in the company are not always ex-founders, they don't bring that mindset, and they have other competing priorities for their team. And, you know, every team ever in any company is under-resourced, and they're going to do what they can do to hit their own OKRs and whatnot. There's no time to think about these things. So I think on a theoretical level, I think everybody would say, at least in hindsight, be like, oh yeah, sure, that sounds like a good idea. But you can only execute on that idea when you have that like singular focus where that idea is your idea. But in no company is that the only idea. It's probably like one of the many, and it gets just thrown out. To
what extent do you think? So you're like, okay, I need the one Stripe checkout, and that's like a beautiful thing. That small little bit of market feedback and feedback loop is powerful enough to propel this engine forward. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think it's just always pick the next thing that has that property versus try to map out how this is going to evolve? Because you may kind of get pulled into a local optimum or a dead end that doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. This is something we actually struggle with even at our scale, because, you know, we are now just about big enough where we get big is even the wrong word, just about like present enough that we get inbound requests, and we have to parse through the requests to say, hey, this one we'll work on immediately. This one maybe next month, and this one we should probably just say no, go use something else. And there is some of that. Like, I think when we were extremely small and we had like 3 customers, we were trying everything, as a result of which a lot of our stack is productized, to say, because the reason we have everything from like indexers to hubs to webhooks to SQL playgrounds to XYZ is because we were looking for that one Stripe checkout and see what
number of products can we get that Stripe checkout on? And turns out there were quite a number of them. And so we productized our whole stack.
Wait, so why was that your strategy to go breadth first versus depth first? Why not just go super deep on the first thing that started working?
So actually, there's some truth to what you're saying, but we actually did think about this as depth first, but from a protocol perspective. So one way to go breadth first would be like, hey, add one protocol and then keep adding protocols. Like people ask us all the time, when are you adding protocol X, Y, and Z?
And protocols being like Lens or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And we all said no. Like we were like, we want to understand one protocol very well, and we want to go deep. So that's the depth. But in that depth, there's some breadth, right? So for that one protocol, the reason we do all of these things is we both try to understand the stack of like, what can you build with the protocol? And then two, because we are so hyper-focused on one protocol, we actually have to build things that let others grow the protocol. Otherwise, we are going to fail because our whole like existence is now tied to this one protocol, right? So if we don't serve a little bit of breadth within this protocol, we can't.
Then people are going to get stuck on some other part of the problem.
Exactly. So for example, obviously we have the hubs and indexers. So clients like Supercast exist. But because we have webhooks, I don't know if you've used AutoMod. It's this like channel moderation, cast moderation thing, fully built off of our webhooks. Where John, legendary developer, we hadn't even made the API, like the webhooks available as a product. We only had it in our UI, and he reverse engineered the APIs on our dev portal to start using the webhooks. And we always wanted to make the webhooks available. That's why the APIs were built in a way that we could externalize them. But he just like kind of tried it and found like, oh, these are already externalizable. And he just started pinging them. And AutoMod was built before our webhooks were announced. And so we came out and we were like, hey, okay, we have webhooks. Everybody can use them. But AutoMod wouldn't exist if we hadn't expanded to the breadth of webhooks on our stack. And so we want to make sure that if you are a developer on Farcaster, you have the tools to build. And if you don't, then come to us and tell us what you need, and we'll figure out how to give it to you. Unfortunately, if you're outside Farcaster, it's probably harder for us to do that today, even if there is that one Stripe checkout, and we say no to those opportunities. But within Farcaster, we try to do as much as possible.
So when you think about Neynar, we were both at FarCon, and Dan and Varun, when they were describing the strategy of Merkle and Farcaster for succeeding, they had this 3-part statement, right? Which was, I think, I'm going to try to do this live. It was grow with crypto, cozy corners, and then more Legos or better Legos, better builder Legos.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what that equation is for Neynar? Like, what are the core things you have to do, you have to get right to succeed?
Great question. This is one of those questions I should spend more time thinking about, but I'm gonna try and do this live. I think.
Well, I feel like you could take 2 of the 3 from Farcaster. They still apply.
They still apply. Yeah. So I think for us, I think grow with crypto applies at the higher level, but I think grow with Farcaster applies at the very specific level where as long as we support what Farcaster protocol evolves to, I think that's good for our company. So for example, today's dev call later today, they're going to talk about decentralized channels. We've been looking at the channel spec for a while. And for a while, I mean like 2 days, because these things move very quickly. And so I'm actually quite excited about that channel spec. I think it's like simple, but very composable. And
how does it work?
So I'll speak to one part of it. I don't know how much Dan has talked about it, so maybe we should wait for the dev call. But I think one thing that he did well is that, so channels today, or at least the content of the channels today, is already on the protocol, right? Everything is a cast or a reaction, blah, blah, blah. And you can get that. That's how we have channel APIs. And the way we get that is because the channel URL is what they call a FIP2 target URL. And it's the target URL is already on the protocol. And all the casts in that channel map to that target URL. So we can go fetch that data from hubs and we can serve it. What's happened, and again, great call on product-driven protocol development, where you push things to the protocol as they evolve instead of immediately pushing it because you don't know how they might change. One things we discovered recently over the last couple of months is channels get overloaded by spam. And you go to a channel and it's just like a bunch of garbage before you find any good content. And so they launched this like curation model where they, in the app today, they have a trending feed and a recent feed. And the recent feed is just all of them if you want to see that. And then trending is what gets moved over once people interact with recent, or once the channel host interacts with recent, moves over. Very recently, AutoMod automated this, where you can set up rules according to which things will get liked automatically. It'll count as engagement and it'll get moved over to the trending feed. And what the channel protocol spec does is, because now we understand how channels can get spammy and how to move between spammy content on recent to curated content on trending, they pushed the same curation model to the protocol level, where at the very simplest layer, all you have to do is the channel host, or the channel hosts in plural, have to engage with the content in some way. And they can create rules for engagement, and they can set an automated engagement bot, which is AutoMod in this case. And AutoMod can be added as a host, in which case the host has engaged with the content. And as soon as it's engaged with, it becomes part of the curated content. And now from the hub, you can fetch both the raw content or the curated content. And it's a super simple thing, right? Like nice. None of the logic of curation is at the protocol level. It's at the AutoMod level. The protocol is just binary distinguishing between curated, non-curated, and channel host can determine what counts as curation.
Curated is almost like a tag that can be added to a cast exactly. within a channel. Yeah,
exactly.
And how the logic by which it's added is irrelevant. It happens at a higher level of the stack.
Exactly. And that gives like builders, to the other notion about building Legos, it gives the builders something to build with. You can actually imagine people doing it better than Warpcast, and somebody else coming in and doing better curation. And it's abstracted away from the protocol now. And then we, as like the infrastructure providers, can both pull the data, can build our own building blocks on top of it, and then figure out how to serve it to clients. So I actually forgot how we got onto this tangent, but that is how channel decentralization is coming about, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, I forget how we got there too, but so maybe let's transition to Frame Studio.
Yeah.
So why are you building Frame Studio? And you're kind of violating some of my mental models of you as an infrastructure company. So what's going on there behind the scenes, and how do you think about this?
I'm glad we are violating mental models. Like, I think that's what it's meant. Like, I always want to be violating 10% of the mental model at any given time. Otherwise, it's not good for a startup this small. Yeah, I think any company, but definitely a startup this small. So essentially what happened was frames happened, and then we saw that huge spike in usage, and we were pretty much the first and only infra company that allowed you to build frames quickly. And there were some open, like even today, all the open source SDKs like Onchain Kit, Frog, Frame.js, all of them reference Neynar in the background, because Neynar was the only background thing available, and you start your frame with an SDK on the front end side, and it automatically uses Neynar in the background. And so that was like a big scaling moment for us, and we kind of went through that journey. What we also found is that there were a lot of people who were making bounties of like, hey, can you make this frame for me? And some of the frames were really simple. And we were like, you don't need to pay somebody hundreds of dollars to make this frame. And so we just spent like a weekend, essentially. Like even today, our Frame Studio looks super janky because like there was no design. It was just like us cobbling some buttons together.
Works.
yeah. And so we kind of threw it out. And like everything we do, it was behind a paywall. I'm a big believer in paywalls where it actually helps you validate who really wants something versus who is just like quote unquote trying it out. And obviously, as a new company, you want people to try out your things, but you want the right people to try out your things. So we put it behind a paywall and just to see who would actually use it. And turns out a bunch of people. They came in, they paid $9 a month. Some of them pay $9 month over month, and they only use the Frame Studio because they can make as many frames as they want. We had a range of limits. Like our Frame Studio used to have a limit where you could only make 10 frames on an account ever. And we were waiting for somebody to reach out and be like, hey, I can't make another frame. And that happened in like a week. And we were like, okay, because, we hadn't even started instrumenting the data. Our instrumentation was the customer reaching out saying, hey, I can't make 11th frame. And that would be our data point of like, okay, one customer has like hit this limit. And so that happened. And so obviously now we instrumented and everything and we can see who's doing what. But that experiment worked, at least to the extent where we could be like, okay, we can keep doing this for a little bit just to see what happens. And obviously the frames hype has died down now and fewer people are making frames. But we believe there's something there in like just making what is today just a simple widget, but it's essentially for the simplest use case, it's a new storytelling format where you can tell stories in like a connected game-like manner, where Instagram stories are linear, where you go from one to next to next to next.
Wow, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. It's like a choose your own adventure with
exactly.
Like user feedback in the loop.
Exactly. So it's like play your own little story game, but you can now crisscross and go different ways and like play out that story in like different formats. And this is where I've always been into social, and like this is the kind of stuff I've generally been thinking about, and now Web3 makes it possible to think about it in even more interesting ways. So when that came about, I was like, oh, this is interesting. This can be a storytelling format. And so we built a tool around that storytelling format. And we are making that tool better, I think, over the next 2 weeks, then 2 weeks after that, it'll keep improving. So we'll see if that hypothesis is true. I think there's a pretty large case that people just don't care about the storytelling format. And there's many storytelling formats people don't care about, and this is one of them, and we'll move on. But I think it's a hypothesis worth testing. So that's where we are now in this journey.
I also feel like it ties into another powerful thing, which is that the lines between users and developers is blurring more and more. And that's particularly true in the context of Farcaster, where half of the people are builders. But generally speaking, especially with all the AI help we can get, and it's like you can what's really the difference ultimately. So it's cool to blur that line a bit.
Absolutely. We actually have builders who will build something on our stack, and that's a full product. And then they'll use the no-code Frame Studio to launch that product. And they'll quickly build like a launch frame. And so
that's cool.
Yeah, so there's like intermingling of this as well, that where the no-code studio isn't actually just used by people who can't code. It's also used by people who can, but they just don't want to spend that added time, and they'd rather do it quickly for something simple.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask some more personal questions about building, operating, those sorts of things.
Let's do
so you had a cast a few days ago which I agree with, which is companies become extensions of their founders.
Yeah.
Why did you say this, and how is it the case with Neynar? Maybe I'm actually curious how you would answer the same question for, say, Farcaster and or Coinbase as well. How have companies become extensions of their founders?
Yeah. That is actually the perspective I was thinking about, because I was thinking about a few different companies, and it led me to that conclusion. So if we start with the biggest of them, like Coinbase, I think Brian is a very methodical, level-headed, long-term minded individual. And it wasn't like, if you were at Coinbase for like a small amount of time, or if you look at the company for a certain slice, it's hard to always see that in the company. But if you look at the company for the last 10 years, and it's been more than, I think it's like 12 years old now, because it started in 2012, it actually becomes quite clear. Like Coinbase has been about doing one thing, or at least for the most of its time, one thing. Now it's a big company, it does many things, but it was mostly an on-ramp company doing one thing really well in the right manner. Like nothing shady behind the scenes, like no money laundering, no operating in countries where we don't have the license, like follow the laws of the land, work with people to make them understand about crypto, and get the on-ramp piece really, really, really right. Like in the US, at least, there's pretty much no other on-ramp. And that's because one company like fully focused on how to do it correctly. And when I was at Coinbase, there were so many times where, Binance would be doing something or FTX would be doing something, and they'd be offering outrageous like APYs and different kinds of rewards. And there were many conversations within the company about like, how do we do something? We were losing customers. And if you look at Brian, like, I think most of the time, at least like 99.9% of the time, he would just be like, no, like we are doing this in the right legal compliant manner. That's who we are as a company. I think that I, as in like Brian, would think that, hey, there would be long-term consequences of this and regulators would come in, and that's the time Binance and FTX wouldn't work and we will. And there were swaths of time in between where it was hard to believe that because nothing like that was happening and we were losing market share. But that is what happened. And Coinbase has the prime category today. And so I think it is a reflection of how Brian thinks and who he is, and that's reflected in the company he built. I think if you look at Farcaster, it's largely similar of like, I think there's actually some derivative, like every ex-Coinbase, like every founder who is ex-Coinbase has learned something from Coinbase and applied that perspective into the company they are building. And I think that's true of Farcaster, that's true of Neynar. And it's fortunate to be able to learn from the best so closely. But I think Farcaster is a very sensible, methodical, driven protocol where there's no like built-in gamification. There's no like incentives to do XYZ. It's like, here's the protocol, here's how it works. They have thought about both on scaling on the engineering architecture side, but also about the protocol development, all like at the same time, where the protocol isn't pushed out at the very beginning. You want to understand the primitives first and then keep pushing it out on the protocol over time, which is also something like at least I saw for like Ethereum is somewhat like that. But it didn't fully launch like that. It launched as a protocol, developers came in, they built something, and you keep launching layers over it. Social is somewhat different. And that I've enjoyed a lot. And I think Neynar today, like both how, not only what we build, like the reason we build on Farcaster is because, like I said, I was in the gym, like I was doing some deadlifts or something, and I was thinking, what risk are we going to take? And I was like, okay, we were going to take this Farcaster risk.
You were doing deadlifts?
yeah.
Nice.
Most of my risks require like adrenaline, serotonin, whatever, and that happens in the gym for me.
Yeah.
And so I remember like doing that set and then messaging Manan and being like, yeah, we are going to be a Farcaster company.
You were feeling that power.
Yeah. And so the reason is like Neynar is a Farcaster company is also a reflection of what I was feeling at the time and who I was. The reason we don't do like gamifications or promos or tiers or whatever is because the same level-headed mindedness applies, like product market fit above everything else. And that's what we are here to find. And I think there's also like, at least in our case, there's both that and then there's the design side of it. Like if you look at our website or the way our APIs are built or the shape of our APIs, like we spend a lot of time, and we just talked about this a little bit ago into how we think about our stack, but we shape our APIs very thoughtfully, like the response structure, the keys to every value, like how would the developer interpret that? Like every object, for example, self-describes what it is, which we learned from Stripe, another very methodical, level-headed company, where if you are using Neynar APIs, you never have to guess what the object is. You can just do like dot object on any object and it'll tell you what the object is and you can know at any part of the code. And these like simple things that we add because, again, extensions of who we are. And if you go on our website, there's like slight hints of playfulness. Like my favorite part of our website, if you scroll all the way down, is that there are little mini Farcaster arches floating around, like tiny stars in the galaxy. Like Neynar, the name comes from Lord of the Rings because I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan and nerd, and I picked that name. And the Farcaster
is Peter
arches,
Thiel going to try to steal the domain from you in the future?
I don't think we, like
what is Neynar in Lord of the Rings?
It's water. So Nain, the root word in Elvish, which is Quenya, means water, and Neynar is a water-based planet. And I was just watching Lord of the Rings, thinking about our company, and back then we weren't doing Neynar, what Neynar is today. And one, I like the name because it's an abstracted name, right? You can do anything in the background, and the name
It's
can
a
just
beautiful
work.
name.
Thank you.
It's it's got an
Yeah, I like.
aesthetic quality to it.
Yeah. That's what, like, when I found it, and I was, because I was thinking about Lord of the Rings, I was looking at Elvish words,
Yeah.
and I came across Neynar, and I was like, oh yeah, exactly. It has that like nice quality to it. We found the .eth, the .com, .org, .xyz, like all the domains, and yeah, it's just like, we have everybody talks to us about you should change your name at some point. Nobody knows what it does. One, I think there's some benefits to it because we can do what we want and the name doesn't matter. But we have actually thought about changing our name. We just never found a better one, and we didn't spend enough time thinking about it. And finding a name is hard, so we kind of moved on from that problem, and so we are Neynar. But yeah, all of that is to say that that's why, like, I don't know what I was thinking when I made that cast, but in some part of my head, I was thinking all of that. And it just made, I say things on Farcaster that I'm thinking, like, there's no like planning, scheduling, format, whatever. I just, like, I'm on my phone, and I usually cast when I'm on my phone because I'm working on my computer. And I was probably doing something, and that thought appeared fully materialized in my head, and I just casted it out. But yeah, that's my take.
Nice. Yeah, it's really cool to trace how the Coinbase DNA from Brian Armstrong has made it into crypto, and
Yeah.
it's like it's almost like it's like interesting to think about how it's a DNA of methodicalness, having principles, being long term. It's almost like the perfect contrast to the fluffy, crazy, like short term oriented sides of crypto. And it's like it's like the traits that survived the evolutionary landscape,
Absolutely.
and now it's like embedded within a whole bunch of companies that are succeeding in their own way. So it's really cool to see it in that way.
Absolutely. I've been fortunate to learn that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, another question is, I think you were one of the early people on the base team before you spun out.
Yeah.
And I've heard Jesse, he shared the story of how there was this long stretch of kind of like the base idea maze and thinking about what this whole thing was going to be.
Yeah.
I'm curious what that was like for you, and if you learned anything from that journey.
Yeah, I mean, that was very fun. I think, Jesse and I had obviously known each other for a while by the time I joined that project, but it was our first chance to like work really closely together. I learned Jesse has an insane level of energy that he brings to like every single discussion he has every day, which is great. We had a lot of fun with that. Some of the, like, I learned more about team building as well, which I think Coinbase learned as a company at the same time that we learned as a team. Where if you think about Coinbase as a company, like when I joined Coinbase 2019, it was like not even 1,000 people. It was like anywhere between like 600-ish odd people. And maybe there were some like not full-time people I'm not counting, but somewhere around that number. By the time I left, it was around 4,000-ish people.
Wow.
But in between, there was actually a time where it was like 7,000 people or close to it, like 6,600 people or something. And they did like 2 large layoffs. And like we had grown too quickly as a company. And Brian actually has a cast about it somewhere on Farcaster, and I can link it later, where he's been pretty vocal about it. Like, hey, during the bull market phase of 2021, 2022, we overhired, didn't always hire the right people. It grew too quickly. And it didn't work. Like it became like a more loaded organization that actually shipped less than more. And in the early days of Base, because it was the same timeline, like Base started somewhere in 2022 or late 2021, early 2022, we followed the same thing. Like it went from a team of like 5 people. When I joined, I was maybe the 5th member or something, to like, I don't know, 50 people back to 5 people. And we went through this curve where we like ideated a whole bunch of things, hired a lot of people, moved organizations around within the company to make it a sizable team, and then realized like, hey, what we actually want to build is this like Optimism bedrock L2. And then the whole team transitioned and it was back to 5 people. And so the core engineering team has been the same. It was actually smaller at 5. It used to be like 10, 11 or something. But the core leaders of the team have been the same. Obviously, Jesse, Michael Tehoog, a few others. And that was also a good learning process for me for my next thing, like how to actually grow, how to hire, what roles to hire for, what kind of fit to look out for. And I think what we also learned, funnily enough, in some ways we should have known. I think part of the team always had this feeling, Michael Tehoog's like especially, and I think Jesse also, but Jesse and I were leading the product and engineering side. And we were never like, we never went straight to this solution of building the L2, which in retrospect, maybe we should have. But we ideated a whole bunch of things. And in the back of our mind, there was always this idea of like, oh, it should probably just be an L2 Ethereum thing. And it was kind of interesting to like go through the whole process, and it was painful and stressful at times. And we had to bring this large team along and the exec team and walk them through every version of the idea. Obviously, all of them got shot down in some shape or form, some by us, some by somebody else, before we arrived at the L2. And I think that was also a good journey of like Occam's razor, right? Like the simplest thing. If you build it right and ship it with the right intentions and motivations, it'll likely work. And that's what we ended up doing.
Yeah, the best ideas are very simple in that way.
Yeah.
Okay, next one. Our mutual friend Salvino told me that he pings you with questions at like 11 p.m. on Saturday night and you reply immediately. And I've kind of had the same experience in our interactions. So what's your philosophy around that?
There isn't a lot of philosophy. I think the simplest the answer to this is that I'm usually on my computer because I'm working. And I have I'm one of those people who runs like 100 apps at the same time. And I have like a super beefy machine just to do that. And so I have all this stuff running all the time. And so
you're context switching, or do you kind of go between maker and manager schedule? How do you work?
There's no real manager schedule today because we don't really have people to manage. There's maker and founder schedule, I think, where I just have a lot of operations stuff to deal with. And that takes up a sizable
rippling.
Chunk. Yeah, rippling.
I felt the rippling pain.
I got on a call with Rippling, didn't fully last, on the airplane. They were like, I was on the support chat with them and they were like, oh, can we get on a call? And I was like, yeah, let's try it. I didn't tell them I was on an airplane, and it did fully work. Like I could hear them, but they couldn't hear me because the upload was slow. But man, Rippling takes up so much of my time. We solved that one though. But yeah, it goes from founder schedule of doing all this like operational stuff to like maker schedule. My maker schedule is usually very late at night, where pretty much most people have gone to bed. Manan might be the only one awake. And then he's doing his thing. I try to let him do his thing as much as possible. Probably not enough, need to do more there, but try to leave him alone. And I'm doing my thing. During the day, it just gets taken up by other stuff. And most people don't message me between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. And so so
that's the alpha. If you want good support, ping you at 2 a.m.
I mean, if that time gets taken up, we'll see how I work around that. But usually if you're pinging me in the middle of the day, I'm probably doing something that doesn't fully require my 200% attention. And so I can just respond. It also, like, another reason I do that, and it's not just happenstance. Like, I think I both happen to do that and like doing that because it keeps me very core to how the product is functioning. And the muscle memory was built because during the first 5 months, we had no instrumentation. Like we wouldn't know when our servers are down until somebody told us that, hey, your servers are down. And so I got like trained to like look at incoming comms just to know if what I was building was working. And now obviously we have all instrumentation and alarms and PagerDuty setup and status websites and all of that. But the muscle memory stays where something comes in and I'm like, oh, is something wrong? And then I look through it. It's usually something simple. There are some things I don't reply to, like, the recent spam of the protocol. Like there's a bunch of people who reach out and my Telegram is super public and they'll just ask me about something random about how to like farm a token or drop a token, and you can like the English is broken or they have like you can tell all the signs of a bot farmer essentially, and obviously those kind of things I don't reply to it.
So practically speaking, because I feel like a lot of people in crypto are dealing with the same issues of Telegram overload, and your Telegram handle is like your personal Telegram handle is all over your docs and like Notion docs, and it's like just ping Rish for feedback.
Yeah.
How are you do you just like go through them one by one, or do you have a kind of system?
No, I actually go through them. It's the top signal. Like I think the stage of the company, like we have always built this company by understanding what's happening and what people want. And I want people to ping me with questions, not just questions about like, not just things are breaking or how do I use this, but how do I build XYZ? Because a lot of the time what we end up shipping is because somebody was ideating with me about how to build something and we didn't have that and they didn't have that. So we actually built a product around it. And so that's why it's public, and I want people to tell me what they need. And so far it's been working. And there will be a time where it doesn't work and we'll get there when we get there. But it's not now. And so, it's still going.
Okay. And maybe as a last question, Linda Shea said you seem to have a great co-founder relationship with Manan, and was curious about what you guys do to kind of support that. And just what can you share about your relationship together?
It's funny you ask. I'll share one quick thought before answering that exact question, which is like, one, yes, we do. I think I personally believe, like I was coming over on this car ride here and I was thinking, what are the reasons Neynar would succeed? And I think my top reason is that because Manan works at this company.
Wow.
And I think that's why it'll succeed. And I feel extremely lucky and fortunate to have a co-founder who is as good as he is. Honestly, we don't do enough to nurture the relationship. Like, it works, which is great. Like we trust in each other, and the way we make decisions is, I think we have never really had people talk about co-founder chats. We've never really had any of those conversations. It's funny because my other significant relationship, which is my wife, we never really had a marriage conversation. I've always been kind of the person who just knows and feels it out, and I just kind of knew that, hey, that's the person I'm going to marry. And in this case, the answer was so obvious to me. Like, if I'm going to leave Coinbase, who am I going to work with? And it's going to be Manan. Like, Manan put out a cast a few days back or a month or so back where he was like, I didn't want to work on this project. I just wanted to work with Rish. And because he was working on this, I ended up working on this. And I'd forgotten about it. But that's essentially what happened. And so in my head, it was always clear, like, hey, I can only do this if Manan works on this with me. And
why did you feel that way? What's so special about Manan?
I think like he's among the few people. I think Farcaster team is something like this, but he's among the few people where he's really excited about crypto, about protocols like Farcaster, optimistic, like long-term thinker, like way more long-term thinker than I am in many ways, because I get stressed out and he's just like doing his thing. But all the positive things you want in an engineering co-founder. And then he also really understands the technical side, where he can build all this complicated infrastructure stuff, where I'm mostly doing as told And now I can do a few things on my own. But I was not going to build this by myself. And so both like super strong technicals, like we had worked together, obviously, so we had a working relationship. And there were times at Coinbase where the stuff we built was actually popular enough back in the day that the whole company would go down because of the traffic Coinbase Earn was getting.
Wow.
And we'd be up at like 4 a.m. in the morning trying to like build everything back up. And we had a lot of fun doing it. Like I both learned how to work under that stress, he obviously so. And we also had fun like building a team, building a product, and going through that cycle. And it kind of made me feel like, yeah, we should actually do it this time without the safety net of a big company. And then everything else I said, like I think his excitement and optimism and long-term thinking and technical skills, it was, yeah. I never put those variables together in my head. Like I said, I just kind of feel it out.
It was more intuitive.
Yeah, I just kind of knew. And so we went with that.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. Here's to a long, long journey ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time.
Of course. Yeah, this was great. Thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm going to make a small ask here. If you've been listening to these conversations and want to support what we're doing here, I would really, really appreciate if you could leave a rating and a review for the podcast wherever you're listening to it. This might seem like a small thing, but it will really help other people also discover the show. Thank you. I'm grateful to be able to do this and look forward to being here together again soon.